This talk will have more vigor than rigor, which is probably what you need if you're going to be staying up all night and all day for 24 hours, because it tells the story of one escapade. One N1 explores serendipity in her own practice. And hopefully, sometimes rigor can turn to rigor mortis. So I hope you appreciate this approach. So I'm going to talk about who's at the wheel. That's what my talk is about, but it's about many other things. And it's about this expression that chance favors the prepared mind. There's a beautiful cartoon there by a famous Australian cartoonist of how that might work. But I've always found this a bit of a motherhood statement. And I always want to know, how on earth do I prepare my mind? Please, Louis Pasteur, be a bit more helpful in helping me understand how to prepare it. So this is a kind of taxonomy of preparation that I've gone through, and at least for myself. So chance favors the prepared mind, conscious mind, many, many different kinds of minds. And I'll go through them first by looking at three metaphors that creative writers and creative people have used to describe serendipity and to describe that beautiful serendipitous moment of inspiration. First is David Lynch's beautiful metaphor of fish. And as you know, he's a famous director, Twin Peaks, etc., and also a very famous advocate of meditation. And he sees the two going together really beautifully. So he writes, ideas are like fish. If you want to catch little fish, you can stay in the shallow water. But if you want to catch the big fish, you've got to go deeper, down deep. That's in the consciousness field. The fish are more powerful and more pure. They're huge and abstract, and they're very beautiful. That's David Lynch speaking from the heart about his book. And I think that often it's a beautiful metaphor because there is this chance element in catching fish, right? Virginia Woolf, from her trailblazing book, A Room of One's Own, has this wonderful description of creativity and the serendipitous process. And it's her image, if David Lynch's image was fish, hers is a spider's web. And she has this wonderful kind of image because she says that a work of fiction is not something that stands alone like a spider's web in abstract. It has the social and material realities involved in it. And so her big research question was, why aren't there any women in the literary canon? Why wasn't there a sister for Shakespeare who was equally as talented doing amazing things in the 1600s? She writes, for it is a perennial puzzle why no woman wrote a word of that extraordinary literature when every other man, it seemed, was capable of song or sonnet. What were the conditions in which women lived? I asked myself. For fiction, imaginative work that is not dropped like a pebble upon the ground as science may be. Fiction is like a spider's web, attached, ever so lightly perhaps, but still attached to life at all four corners. Often the attachment is scarcely perceptible. Shakespeare's plays, for instance, seem to hang there, complete by themselves. But when the web is pulled askew, hooked up at the edge, torn in the middle, one remembers that these webs are not spun in midair by incorporeal creatures, but are the work of suffering human beings and are attached to grossly material things like health and money and the houses we live in. So she came up with this theory of, a woman has to have a room of one's own and an independent income in order to write. So that was her image. And the image I have for Lewis Hyde, poet, who also wrote this extraordinary book called The Gift, is the idea of creativity as a gift that is exchanged in the public sphere, but in a spiritual sense too. So he says that an essential portion of any artist's labor is not creation so much as invocation. And he talks about the gift of creativity kind of participating in a circle that you don't know where the circle goes. Like I get emails from people I've never met telling me, thank you for your book, it really touched my heart, and so on. So his analogy, his metaphor is the tribal gift exchange. And he says that anarchism and gift exchange share the assumption that it is not when a part of the self is inhibited and restrained, but when a part of the self is given away, that community appears, that creative community. And so he writes this beautiful thing. He says a gift, he talks about how people in tribal societies might, for example, after a hunt, they'll give a piece of their hunt back to the forest spirits. And he says the gift leaves all boundary and circles into mystery. Think creativity too. The passage into mystery always refreshes. If when we work, we can look once a day upon the face of mystery, then our labor satisfies. We are lightened when our gifts rise from pools we cannot fathom. Then we know they are not a solitary egotism and they are inexhaustible. Anything contained within a boundary must contain as well its own exhaustion. And I love that idea of the abundance of inspiration coming from everywhere through this idea of going into mystery. And I'll talk more about mystery in a minute. But I think that chance also favors a trusting mind. I want to talk for a minute about creativity being such a mysterious process. It's so mysterious, it's hardly surprising that there's a sense of alterity or coming from outside that accompanies inspiration. This is often projected and externalized and giving kind of presence to a divine messenger, a muse. And for millennia, people have had muses, this idea that heaven and earth are connected for the human artist aspiring beyond their own limits. Many writers have talked about being at the service of the muse or not in control of their own words or their own output. A friend of mine, Stephen Sewell, he's a very well-known screenwriter, says that he is a secretary for his imagination. And this is a theme that of alterity elsewhere, otherness, inspiration coming from otherness, it's replete in literature. And Blake says, and though I call them mine, I know that they are not mine, being of the same opinion with Milton when he says that the muse visits his slumbers and awakes and governs his song when morn purples the east. And it's this tradition, I feel, because Messiah Eliade, a religious historian, talks about how we are today. We're non-religious, but non-religious man descends from homo religious. And so this idea of coming from elsewhere, having a muse, is a very, very nice one. And I think that it kind of is relevant to this day and age even, because I think we have to future-proof the muse somehow. Encountering a muse today is important because it puts a mortal face back into the very human process of generative thinking in an age when we have algorithms and information generation and discovery is so easy. I want to talk about another muse too that is very different from Calliope, who's the Greek muse here of epic poetry, so beautiful it will unglove you from your body and take you to transcendent heights. She's one of the 9 Greek muses of the arts. But I want to talk to you about another muse I love from Federica Lorca, and this is the Duende. Duende is from the Spanish tradition, thought of as a kind of goblin, I guess. Really, really beautiful muse. And so Lorca's goblin, Duende, only visited, according to him, with the most poignant, ecstatic, disturbing kinds of truth, often that involve one's mortality, like in a bullfight, or passion, like in this flamenco dancing. And he also talked about some sort of sacrifice had to be at stake. The creator's blood and skin had to be at stake. And he distinguished his duende from that angel muse from outside. His came from inside. His duende, he said, came from the remotest mansions of the blood. It came on a wind that smells of baby's spittle, crushed glass, and jellyfish veil, announcing the constant baptism of newly created things. And I love this statement of the duende as this kind of magical passion. In this story here, he writes, years ago, an 80-year-old woman won first prize at a dance contest in Jerez de la Frontera. She was competing against beautiful women and young girls with waists supple as water, but all she did was raise her arms, throw back her head, and stamp her foot on the floor. And in that gathering of muses and angels, beautiful forms and beautiful smiles, Who could have won but her moribund Duende, sweeping the ground with its wings of rusty knives? Thought I'd take a little break now because this is the tabula rasa, the blank page of the writer. And I'm going to take you into a little experiment that I took with my muse that I wrote up for Wendy and Samantha's book, The Art of Serendipity. And let me take you through the journey. So every literary journey, a lot of literary journeys take you to this other world, right? Here's the wardrobe in C.S. Lewis's Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Over here on the left is the portal in Being John Malkovich. It's in an office that takes you to the New Jersey Turnpike and into people's minds. It's a speculative portal. And on the right is platform 9 3/4 from Harry Potter that will take you to the magical world that is not the Muggle world in which we currently live. So I had to decide on what portal I would have for my encounter with serendipity. And my chapter's called The Anablex Guide to Serendipity and Creativity, because this fish here is called the Anablex, and the Anablex has 4 eyes, importantly. 2 eyes to look into the world, and 2 eyes to look down into the inner landscape, which is also replete with objects and inspiration and serendipitous encounters, just as the outside world is. So that's my portal object. And I asked the fish and I asked my muse many questions. So this emikinetic, insider, outsider, observer, participant approach of the Anablex, and combined with some kind of really free thinking flow of consciousness work, and then some analysis of what I wrote, helped me to discover my muse. And so I rely on a muse. I've named her. I mean, I'm not taking her from a Greek tradition. I'm half Indian. So I'll try and name my muse. Let's call her Paripurnya, after the Sanskrit word for accomplished and whole. And I wrote, she's the muse of stories, but also of music. And I first encountered her in a 24-track recording studio when I heard a musician ask, did we get it down? Did we get it? Did we capture it? So this muse arrives when you capture more than one sound on a track. Think 24-track studios. Think that Duende, something beyond what you have got down in a digital track. What is it? It's a kind of gestalt of many tracks and many feelings and many things that you conjure together, a sum greater than its parts, and a sense of connectedness with the whole. And for me, the muse always leaves you with an unexpected gift of transcendence, quite beyond the suffering of Duende. This is my personal muse I'm talking about. It gives me a gift of connectedness with an audience. And for me, Parapunya harnesses the yearning for transcendence and also allows the creator to pass this gift on to other readers, other people experiencing your practice. Don't have an interest in that, a whole idea of music, absolutely personal. I asked my question to me. I have a quest to better understand my personal place to inspire me. So some might say my muse is fictional, but now the dissection of the muse. It's like kind of holding a fairy up to a corkboard, put nails through it. So my quest is to understand her, not to find her. I find her everywhere. I find inspiration everywhere, and moments when I'm required to sit on this swiveling chair and analyze my day job, she suggested I take flight more. Swift enough, and I can go anywhere. Watching her too frequently about her ways, except on this occasion I was tasked with by Wendy and Samantha to look at her so I cajole her into my stories. I fascinate my muse with my musings, or fascinate myself. I ask a lot of serendipity. Or is serendipity just your alter ego? What does serendipity like to dress? How? With or without an invitation? And Maya's already given me her first. So in landscape, eyes down, I a park bench. But before I go there, I'll tell you something else. Chance also favors the magpie mind for me. And I'll describe what I mean by magpie mind. This is the role of inspirational writers. It's kind of also like stealing from the world. So did I mention that I'm carrying a book on this journey, part notebook, part scrapbook, a patchwork of quotes and inspiration taken from some of my favorite writers, thinkers, artists, teachers. This book is a mirror for my own work. And sometimes I borrow from my forebears, but as with any mirror writing, the words are always in reverse and the translation is indecipherable to most. And I think that this is where the eyes of the fish look upwards. The Anablex is looking upwards into real people and then bringing them down into an inner world. So, for example, lots of writers will tell you that their characters are inspired by real people. But those real people, the man who cleans windows might become a woman who's a professor, for example, and yet they're the same character. So there's that's the sort of borrowing that I'm talking about. And as for inspiration, I've written, whilst I trust my muse to take me to the edge of a cliff and fly me across on the wings of a dragon, I'm not an entirely irrational human being. I want to know that others have been supported by the currents of air before me. Indeed, if we are living in a universe where not a single atom has been deleted since the beginning of time, I'm surely traveling on the same air as my heroes traveled before me. And I think that that is something that really sustains me. So where did my mind go? It went to this whole idea of thinking comes from that whole idea of Melophorosis, which is acknowledging that that things actively participate in human cognitive life. So I'm sitting on a park bench in this journey into my own, to find my muse. And why did I get taken to the park bench? Why? Because I'd made a choice. I just a second ago, oh, actually, no, maybe I missed something before. Okay, so here I am. Chance favors a generative mind. I went first in this journey to a signpost. Why did I go to a signpost? Because I'm really inspired by that whole idea of the source of all stories, what Italo Calvino calls the father of all stories. I call it the mother of all stories too. And it's this whole idea that there is a source for everything. So, for example, we have the idea of the source of language coming from what we describe as la langue. So la langue is an idea of Saussure's. La langue is the place where the grammar book of language, the grammar book where everything exists all together. And from that comes la parole, which is speech, which is the many different divergent possibilianism of where the mind could go from a certain source. And the same thing is true of stories. There's a central source of stories, a kind of grammar book. And those are the universal principles of story, like the stories about love and birth and death and things that happen to all humans. And then there's the la parole, the many directions that the imagination can go in. And you could be telling a story in Venezuela, a certain time, people, place, and culture that's different to, let's say, one in Australia or India or anywhere. So that's an important principle for me as well. So from that possibilianism, I landed in this park bench. Why did I arrive here? Because I just read a story by Kafka, about Kafka finding a girl who'd lost her doll on a park bench crying. And he said, don't cry. And he said, come back here tomorrow. And he came back the next day with a letter that the doll had written about her adventures as she went round the world. And he came back every day with all of these letters. And the story goes that, you know, he used these things. And that's why I ended up going to the park bench anyway. But in unpacking this process, I looked at Melophoros's idea of recognizing that things prompt ideas. And in the real world, architects have talked about about how architecture will prompt behavior. So a park bench says, sit on me, for example, according to ecological theory of perception. Well, I think that that happens in the underworld, underwater world, the inner world as well. Our ideas prompt thinking in different ways. And in that water world, things that were happening above the waterline in the real world inspired my inner world. And that has happened with my storytelling. So for example, in my latest novel, elephants with headlights, there's a 200-year-old guru. And he comes from a story that I heard in the real world with eyes looking up now, and as did the house that the story is set in, which is my mother's house. And even things like a chemist shop called The Alchemist is based on a shop that I saw that sold alcohol as well as medicine in India. So you can see the Queen of Serendipity now making her appearance on my humble throne on this bench. She arrives bringing a gift from the story of my own life, as if it were hers. The only thing I cannot quite fathom is how much of the serendipity is hers, how much credit I can take, and whether any of us can take credit for anything when our inspiration is so embedded in the lives of others. Which brings me to my next image, which is, that chance favors the connected mind. And so connectedness is this idea that everything leads to everything. And this allows a creative thinker to take many serendipitous alleyways, often leading to dead ends, and yet enables people to back up, reverse, recalibrate into new, more rewarding directions in search of the most inspiring ideas. And so for me, a mind that is open to the connectedness of all things allows me to bump into the various knowledges that need to combine and connect in new ways that are characteristic of discovery and creative endeavor. So a sense of connectedness to my environment, past, people, etc., open up the whole possibilianism of these connections. They cajole new ideas for me. And so finally, chance favors the learned mind. But I actually questioned this in the end, because although, the library might be a good place to sit, I also go back to writers who overanalyze, who talk about the dangers of overanalyzing. So Blake describes having to abandon the process of reasoning, saying that he cannot describe in words what I mean to design for fear I should evaporate the spirit of my invention. So I've mentioned the external influences of the Muse, but I do not want to disappear her through systematic academic investigation that privileges Newtonian systems of rigor. Hence, I said, perhaps it's better to have more vigor and less rigor, for me at least, in this approach, so that I don't go down the road of rigor mortis. And I end with a beautiful story here from Lewis Hyde again. And he talks of an old English fairy tale set in Devon. There's a man who has a magic barrel of ale that's inexhaustibly filled every night with ale by his fairies, think muses. And this runs freely for years and years until the man's maid removes the cork to find the secret and discovers only cobwebs inside. And thereafter, the ale ceases to flow. And Lewis Hyde writes, the moral is this: the gift is lost in self-consciousness. To count, measure, reckon, value, or seek the cause of a thing is to step outside the circle, to ease being all of a piece with the flow of gifts, and become instead one part of the whole, reflecting upon another part. And so I end my story in The Art of Serendipity with this statement: have I revealed too much through my analysis? Should I return the cork to the ale, lest I see cobwebs in a dry cask? Perhaps it is time to rise now, to back out of the library, to remove my academic gown and walk back into the tall blonde grass of innocent discovery. That's it from me. Happy to, let's talk.
Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. So let's just get everybody right who should be righted. So thank you so much for that, Bem. That really was fantastic. If I could ask you to, yeah, fantastic. So we've got about 15 minutes now to really think about this and to think about what it's like from sort of your viewpoint and other people's comments. So if I can just check in the chat first, if anybody has anything that they've put in the chat already. Everyone's just loving it, basically. That's all we've got, Bem, in here. We've got all your wonderful different minds, which is a list I really want to keep somewhere. So I'm going to take that off you. Does anybody have any questions before I dive in and take over with all the questions? Feel free to put it in the chat, or there's not that many of us, so do unmute and ask. off then. So, oh, hang on, there's a message that's come in. Okay, so what I found particularly interesting was that there was about reading your chapter and about working with you on it, is this oblique approach to serendipity, which I think is really important, because my own feeling is that the second you try to, and my research does actually try to pin it down, which is why I can know that's really hard, it starts to move. Well, I wondered if you wanted to talk more about this feeling that you had that there has to be a mystery to it, and that you need to approach it sort of sideways on, I think you said in your chapter.
Yeah, so for me, creativity, and I do put this in my chapter, that mystery has to remain mysterious. And why did I say that? So I'm a writer, I'm a novelist, and you might have a really faint sort of outline of where you're heading to, a mountain range in the distance, but you don't know how you're going to get there. And so for me, writing is a really beautiful process of discovery. And if I were to know everything about the story I'd written, I probably wouldn't want to reveal it. I probably wouldn't write it. Part of the joy is the encountering of mystery. And I think that that's, if we're talking about Homo religious, that's probably where Homo religious sits, in that whole engagement with mystery and how we want to uncover something. Look, different writers write in and engage with mystery in different ways. I'll give you two other metaphors. For example, Beethoven and Mozart. Beethoven is someone who composes, like he writes different bits of music and then he puts them together. So he composes them like a patchwork together. And Mozart might be someone who starts at the very beginning. He does consecutive writing. So one piece leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. So it's much more, you're following a muse, you're following a story, you're following something that is being revealed to you. But yet there is this choice, like if you go back to that image of the signpost, there are so many million directions, or in the tabula rasa, that's just a blank page. You can go anywhere. So there is this kind of guidance of where you're going, how you're going to find something. I mean, you have to have what I describe as intentional serendipity. You have to sort of guide your feet in some direction. You hear, you get something, a bit of inspiration, and then you follow it, you trail it. And then you back off if it's a terrible idea and it didn't work out, right?
Yeah, no, that was right at the start with creative risk, right? Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat now. So Katrina has asked, have you ever personally experienced creative blocks? And if so, how have serendipitous events and encounters enabled you to overcome them?
Oh, that's a really interesting one, because creative blocks, they can be really stubborn, and you do often they're the voices of others. And so if you look at the divergent and convergent processes of creativity, right back to Guilford's work, you have this beautiful opening up, and then this sort of convergent thinking of editing, where you have to be very serious and think about the rubbish you've written, right? And get rid of the rubbish. Well, you have to kind of let that editor go with creative writing. And there's a beautiful phrase that you should attributed to Ernest Hemingway, which is, you should write drunk and edit sober. But I think that having that drunkenness, being able to take the risk, helps you get over that creative block. And lots of writers have many different techniques to do it. So often it can be like almost like a random input generator. You take the first idea, you follow it, you pursue it, and that opens things up again. I have a little technique. I walk to a place I called Inspiration Point on the harbor near me, and I tell myself that I'm going to write about anything. By the time I come back, I'm going to have to write something about whatever it was that happened to me on that walk, because I really love this whole idea of an embodied walking to it, walking with it, discovering in nature too. So there are so many techniques for overcoming blocks, but serendipity, you have to, when you're in a real block, you really need to trust that first idea that will take you out of it, and trust that. So it is about the trusting mind as well.
So many minds. It's fantastic. Yeah, I really want that list on our society website, actually, of the different types of minds. So I'm going to write to you for that. We've got a couple more questions, so I want to make sure that everyone gets, so that you get a chance to say. Geraldo has asked, could you share with us how you balance technique and sensibility when writing a novel?
So I think that there is something in being, sensibility has the word sensible in it, right? And on some level, you have to let go of being sensible and be more sensitive. When there's a technique involved, you kind of devote yourself to the technique, but then you let go of it as well. A lot of this is all about letting go and being incredibly trusting, because I think unlike other forms of creativity, like science, you'll be dealing with a known unknown. You won't, you know this about Alzheimer's, but you don't know that. So you know that you need to get to that kind of adjacent possible. Whereas with creative writing, you start with absolutely nothing. You start with that tabula rasa, that blank page, right? So you have to have some basic level of technique to overcome that major block. Incredible trust again, but you have to have an idea of what you want to do, and you have to know, have some form, some notion of what's important to say. And I think that standing at that crossroads with all the signs pointing in every single direction, I always think of it also like a filmmaker has this very neutral lens, and you can point that neutral lens at anything. You could point it at someone, you know, who's about to be assassinated in Tiananmen Square, or you could point it to some flowers that are growing in a valley in Switzerland. And no matter what, it's something of yourself, some desire of your own to tell that particular story. So that's where the sensibility comes in. But the technique, I think you need to have a little bit of that down, and so you don't worry about it, and you don't have to give it too much credence, too much control over your narrative.
So those basic skills are just sort of, so you're not worrying about those things, you're just moving forward.
I think you need to worry less and dream more.
And be uncertain and embrace uncertainty.
Embrace uncertainty, embrace mystery, and really love the process, and don't try and, you know, uncover all the mystery at once, because it's really quite luxurious and beautiful, that space.
Dan has a question on mystery. I didn't know if they wanted to unmute, possibly. I thought they probably would. Dan, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi, Bem.
Hi.
How you going?
So nice to see you.
And you. Always love to hear you talk. So thanks for that. I just was, I love how you bring that mystery and the trusting. And I know you do that with your students in your amazing program there as well. But I think I just always run up against that. The artist in me, knows and identifies with what you're talking about, but the educator in me struggles with how to kind of enact that in the academy and in my work in the education sector. Just always seems like creativity gets co-opted by the critical thinking part of the brain. And much as I hate binaries, I wondered if you could talk about the relationship between them.
Yes, and I think that at one of the other conferences we went to, we had that conversation about why is critical thinking always conflated with creative thinking, and there needs to be, with the writer's mind, there needs to be the editor, but that needs to be put on hold while you're doing the writing. And in the academy, there is this terrible privileging of this. I talk about it as a Newtonian scientific kind of presence that inhibits too soon.
Yes.
You can't write drunk because it's not okay to be drunk in a university context, and yet
Right.
you need to liberate that part of the student's ability. So what I do is I'm always really upfront about it. I always say this is the way we're going to do things here, and we spend a lot of time in the first year of the Bachelor of Creative Intelligence and innovation, which is the degree I lead, detoxing this whole idea of knowing and trusting what you know too much, and giving people the time to slow down that search for an easy solution. So we consciously go, okay, we're going to problematize this complex challenge, and we're going to use many disciplinary lenses on it in a really creative emergent space. You're going to have to sit in that creative emergent space and not seek that first answer. We're going to make it harder and harder, and it's going to be more and more complex until you really have got so much more to think with. And that is a real, I always say, you've got to detox those school leavers' minds, because they've just been gaming the system for so many years with right, wrong answers. And there are no right, wrong answers in this process. And you need to go, okay, there are no right, wrong answers. You're not going to be able to game the top mark. We want you to really explore, and also to feel uncomfortable. And we take them through all kinds of like ignorance mapping processes, and we describe the cognitive dissonance that comes with not knowing and uncertainty, and how they have to actually sit with that, and that's going to give them mastery over creative thinking across disciplines. So I teach a transdisciplinary degree. So yeah, I think that being explicit and helping people with processes to manage that, no matter where they come from. We have students from science studying creative intelligence. We have students from, engineering, and those disciplinary mindsets have their own ways of seeing and thinking about the world that you have to also expand. But the beautiful thing is, once you expand people, they don't contract. That's the wonderful thing about transformative education. There's someone else's.
Basically, one of my new favorite things. Once you expand people, they don't contract. I want to have that. I might have that tattooed somewhere on me, but just to remind myself, because that's a fantastic motto for the sort of stuff that you're doing. Thank you. And it reminded me a lot of the stuff that Ron Baghetta was talking about at this morning, whatever, actually late last night for me, about nurturing this idea of uncertainty. And when you were talking about right, wrong answers, that's exactly what he was saying we need to avoid as educators. I think a lot of us in here are educators. This idea of a right, wrong answer that you can kind of just guess, and you're not really interested in the answer, you're interested in the answer the teacher wants you to give. And the people that are very good at gaming that, then they give the right answer, they mind read the teacher. But trying to push beyond that, I think, is really interesting. I just see there's Alistair had a wonderful, Alistair, would you like to read this out? Are you comfortable to have your voice on YouTube and to read it out, because it's a lovely description of exactly what Ben was saying.
Yeah, it's a piece that I used to use with public administration students, because they were always talk about why do we talk about where policy comes from. And then it's from Alison Wonderland, and Alice finds the Cheshire Cat and says, would you tell me, please?
It's just me. I think there's a really bad feedback on your your voice wouldn't be recognised on YouTube because it sounds quite robotic. I don't know whether, do you want to try again?
Shall I read it? Shall I read it, Wendy?
Oh yeah, Ben, yeah, read it. Yes, you can read it. That'd be fantastic.
So on correction, Alice in Wonderland had it about right. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? That depends a good deal on where you want to go to, said the cat. I don't much care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't matter which way you go, said the cat. So long as I get somewhere, Alice added as an explanation. Oh, you're sure to do that, said the cat, if you only walk long enough. And I love that idea of only walking long enough. I think that, so my image, I'm sorry, I always go to images, is a bicycle. If you're going to stand in one spot on a bicycle, you'll topple over. But if the wheels are turning, you'll get somewhere in the end. So I think it is very much about creative practice, using that muscle, keeping the wheels turning to end up getting somewhere. And the serendipitous encounters on the way are what keep you on a high on that journey, because they help you feel rewarded. It's like you feel rewarded that you've gained something from that encounter every time. hence the gift, the alterity. Oh my gosh, I'm lucky, I'm blessed.
There is a lovely feeling about something like that happening, where you feel that it was unexpected and unexpectedly pleasant, that sort of jolts you out of, yeah, that's fantastic. I see we've got a couple more minutes. If anybody does have another question, if not, I've obviously always got them. Vlad's laughing. It's like, when you always ask the question now and then we always run after time, and this is why I'm never doing one of these with her again. I did just want to ask you, just following up, because you came straight after Toshiki, who was obviously talking about inspiration as well, and he suggested that the artists that he followed tend to find their inspiration more socially than actually sometimes from material objects. And I wondered whether you have that sense of, because I noticed as well in your talk, you were definitely placing yourself in a conversation, a dialogue with pre-existing writers and things like that. And I wondered how important that was as well to you.
Yes, and with the outside world in general too. And so the magpie mind, it goes back to the magpie mind. I mean, I think I even use a method. I guess I'm a bit of a conversation thief. I can sometimes listen to a conversation and pluck it whole and go, wow, that's something, I want to use that, and I'll use it. And I heard another writer talking about this and saying that she was in a charity shop and she was in listening to two people changing in a changing room, and one of them was saying to the other, oh, so-and-so had an operation the other day, and she had something removed. I can't remember what it was. What's it, that thing that you have two of? And she said that was such a beautiful conversation. She just had to pluck it whole and put it in her novel. And I think that in relation, in social, in keeping your awareness open at all times to what could be future inspiration or current inspiration is part of the practice, one of the creative practices that novelists certainly live with.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to thank you very much and draw that to a close at the moment. So thank you very much again. And yeah, I'll hand over to Vlad now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bem.